First topic is malabsorption syndromes. Malabsorption syndrome is basically a syndrome that encompasses all types of diseases that may interrupt the process of absorption in the gut, and this will cause a multitude of problems, but primarily growth disorders as well as metabolic disorders. And as a result may lead to disorders such as organ failure or poor growth or short stature, malnutrition, and some certain phenotypes such as poor, brittle or brittle skin or hair, and may cause anemias, etc. So some causes of malabsorption syndrome can be things that will either interrupt the absorption within the gut, so intestinal causes, and these intestinal causes can be further divided into specific types of nutrients that is poorly absorbed, and some examples of disorders that may interrupt the absorption within the intestines are things like an obstruction within the pancreas duct, which inhibits the release of pancreatic enzymes, which are important for the digestion of fat, carbohydrates, and proteins. And
皆さん、こんにちは。
also,
お会いしたいです。東洋大学の入試戦略を読む、東洋大学志望の
also if you have some certain conditions such as cystic fibrosis, then the pancreatic duct could potentially be blocked, or if you have biliary cirrhosis, then also the bile could be blocked, which can inhibit the absorption of pancreatic juice and bile juice. If you have certain conditions such as ulcerative colitis or other inflammatory bowel diseases, then this may cause atrophying of the gut due to these bleedings and this inflammation and autoantibodies, and these can also lead to poor absorption within the gut. And in a disease called celiac disease, we can mention disorders such as autoantibodies against gluten, and gluten is found in carbohydrates such as white rice or white bread, and the amino acid within these proteins are called gliadin, and some symptoms of celiac diseases can be things like malabsorption or diarrhea, chronic diarrhea, a failure to thrive, poor weight gain, short stature, pallor, anemia. And on diagnosis, we may observe some antibodies against anti-gliadin antibodies or anti-transglutaminase antibodies, and also on a endoscopic biopsy of the jejunum, we may see some subtotal atrophy of the intestinal crypts and villus, and so some treatment methods to reduce the amount of gluten that is in the diet, as well as supplying gluten occasionally to see if there's still any response to gluten. Some other disorders that can affect the absorption can include disorders like short bowel syndrome, where you had either a congenital conditions such as gastroschisis or necrotizing enterocolitis, and you had to perform surgery, and as a result you had to cut a large portion of your intestine, and as a result the duration and the length of the intestine has shortened, and the amount of food that is passing through the intestine, the duration is shorter, so there's less absorption, and as a result, may lead to diarrheas and as well as poor absorption or less time to absorb the nutrients. And yeah, so some specific types of like as I mentioned, absorption can also be divided into the specific nutrients that's being not absorbed. So for saccharides, then you might have lactose intolerance due to the lack of lactase in your gut. This may be due to conditions like prematurity, and as a result, you may not be able to digest this milk, which is formed by glucose and galactose, and lactose is formed by these monomers, and you cannot absorb these nutrients. And in other disorders of protein, for example, you may have some maple syrup urine disease where you are not able to metabolize proteins, or as I mentioned, if you have pancreatic duct blockage due to cystic fibrosis, then you may have a absence of amylase or protease or lipases. And so the treatment would be to treat each of these individual disorders. And for example, in lactose intolerance, you should avoid the amount of lactose in the diet, or give hydrolyzed formulas that do not contain lactose. And if you have an allergic reaction to milk due to hypersensitivity to the milk proteins, then you may give a more elementary form of the milk, and this will give more, this will increase the level of absorption. And so you should analyze each disorders separately and try to fix the problem for each disorder. And the next topic I want to talk about is micro and macroencephaly. So in microcephaly and macrocephaly, this is defined as a occipital to frontal diameter or circumference that is either 3 standard deviation less than the average boy or girl in the same age group, or for macrocephaly, it will be 2 standard deviation higher than the average gender or age group. And some causes of microcephaly can be divided into microencephaly, or disorder of the skull bone, or some developmental disorders of the brain. And it can also be due to a syndromic or either isolated microcephaly, and syndromic is usually associated with genetic disorders such as Down syndromes, which is trisomy 21 or 18 or 13. And so about each causes, microencephaly can be caused by conditions such as lissencephaly, which means that the gyrus is in the brain is not present and that there's a smoothing of the brain. Or if you have holoprosencephaly, which means that there's a poor differentiation of the diencephalon, and as a result, there's no separation or proper formation of the prosencephalon, which is the cerebral hemispheres, and you may have a small head due to this lack of maturation and separation of the forebrain. You may have a problem with the cranial osteosynthetase cranial osteosynthesis, and in this disorder, the suture lines of the brain will be sutured relatively quickly and will ossify quickly, and as a result, the head will not be able to expand properly, and this will cause the restriction of the size of the brain. And some treatment methods for microcephaly would be symptomatic. So if there are any seizures, then you should give certain medications. And if you have suture lines that are you, usually it's not possible to treat it due to the congenital nature of the disorder and the fact that it's developmental. However, if there are suture lines that can be cut, then this can also be done to allow the head to expand properly. And for macrocephaly, we can divide the causes into, again, to brain causes. The size of the brain, megaloencephaly, or due to the growing of the bone of the skull, or due to the ventricular enlargement, due to increased intracranial pressure or hydrocephalus, or maybe some tumors or some bleedings. And so for hydrocephaly, it's usually due to a blockage in the normal flow of the cerebral spinal fluid. And as a result of this blockage, then the ventricles will expand and cause an increase in the head mass. Also for tumors, such as common tumors, which are in the infratentorial location, such as astrocytomas or ependymomas or glioblastomas, then these will expand and cause a larger brain. And also these tumors may compress certain structures like the ventricular or the intraductal, the ducts between the spines, and this will cause this hydrocephalus again. And in hemorrhages, such as in caput or in cephalhematomas or in subgaleal hemorrhages, this may also cause a swelling of the skin under the scalp, which may also cause a enlargement in the circumference of the head. And some other causes would include conditions such that the bones of the brain will be enlarged, and some causes of this can either be achondroplasia, where there's a thickening of the bones due to the lack of growth plates, and an increase in this hormonal balance will force the skull bone to thicken. And also in conditions such as a poor maturation of leukocytes, such as in a gamma globulinemia, there could be a maturation problem, and as a result will expand the bone marrow of the bones, and which will cause an increase in the size of the bone marrow capacity and cause this expansion of the skull. And so those were some examples of macrocephaly and causes. And for treatment methods, we could allow some drainage of the cerebrospinal fluid from the ventricles to the abdominal cavity, or for hematomas, which they will usually resolve, and so it's okay to be leaving it. And for the achondroplasia, it's usually not harmful, so it can be left. And for the bone marrow expansion, the relative treatment for the tumors should be performed. And for tumors, you can perform so radiotherapy or chemotherapy because childhood tumors are sensitive to these childhood tumors are sensitive to these radiotherapy and chemotherapy, and therefore should be applied more frequently. So those are some causes and treatments for microcephaly and microcephaly. So the next topic I want to talk about is mitochondrial disorders. So in mitochondrial disorders, which are hereditary, mitochondria is basically a rod-shaped organelle within the cell that is responsible for energy production as well as metabolism of the fat cells or fat chains and converting into energy substrates. And in mitochondrial disorders, the DNA of the mitochondria is inherited via the maternal DNA. So if the mother has this maternal issue, then the disorder will be inherited to the children. Whereas if the paternal mitochondria is affected, then the mitochondria will not be inherited to the children. And some disorders of this can include symptoms such as cardiomyopathies or growth problems, and as a result will have multitude of problems, and diagnostic methods are usually done clinically as well as in the genetic testing. And some treatment methods for this will include symptomatic treatments, and the different types of these mitochondrial disorders can include disorders like MELAS, where there are certain problems concerning mitochondria. So those are some examples of mitochondrial disorders. And the last topic I want to talk about is immune development and disorders of the immune system. So in immune development, we will have progenitor cells which are hematopoietic, and hematopoietic cells are first produced in the fetus in the yolk sac, which is a structure that contains nutrients, and after that the hematopoiesis will be transferred to the liver, and then during the 8th week to the 13th week, the spleen and the bone marrow and the liver will all contribute to the production of blood cells as well as thrombocytes and white blood cells. And finally, after birth, the structures such as thymus or a bone marrow will be the primary source of hematopoiesis. And as the child grows even older, then some parts of the bone marrow become replaced with fat, and only these acral sites, so the epiphysis, will be contributing to the hematopoiesis. And blood cells can be divided into myeloblastic versus lymphoblastic cells. Lymphoblastic cells are responsible for production of B cells and T cells, which are important for humoral and cell-mediated immunity, while myeloblastic cells are important for red blood cells and thrombocytes and macrophages. And there are two stages for immune systems: this acquired versus the innate immune system. Acquired, innate immune system being things like neutrophils or these skin barriers or mucosal barriers or ciliary barriers that will prevent the pathogens from invading the blood, while innate acquired immune responses by the actions of dendritic cells presenting molecules into the to these cells like T cells and B cells. They will be able to perform a reaction. So some disorders in immune responses can originate from any of these sites. And so, for example, in congenital severe combined immunodeficiency, this is a mutation in the adenosine deaminase gene. And as a result, some T cells and B cells will not be activated properly, causing a very severely immunocompromised child, such that it's called a bubble baby. And basically, any type of small infection or flora can potentially give severe infection to the child. In other diseases, we may talk about agammaglobulinemia, X-linked, or Bruton's agammaglobulinemia, which is X-linked recessive disorder of the B cells, which are not able to produce antibodies, so cannot fight against these staphylococcal or streptococcal bacteria. And as a result, there's no affection to the T cells, so the T cell function is actually quite normal. And in other conditions, we may talk about autosomal recessive hypogammaglobulinemia, and this is different from these Bruton's agammaglobulinemia in that it's inherited in the autosomal recessive form. Also, we could talk about hypergammaglobulinemia, IgM hypergammaglobulinemia, and in this disorder, there's a defect in the changing of IgM differentiation to other types of immunoglobulins, such as IgG or A, or E, and as a result, there's an accumulation of IgMs, and this could lead to a deficiency of the other types of antibodies and can lead to certain infections. And so those were some examples of immunodeficiency in children. Finish.
Okay, thank you very much. The time